Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the under the radar games for this upcoming weekend. Definitely a ton that are going to be really interesting, including a huge one for Ashton Genty tonight where he's got to put up big numbers. He's got to be able to get everyone's attention tonight, and we'll see if he can do it against a team that is not great against the run in San Diego State. But let's get into my best bets for this upcoming weekend because I got 8 of them here. We've done relatively well this season. Not necessarily perfect by any means, but definitely on the right side of things and feeling pretty good about where I'm at right now. But let's get into this week 10 because these were a little bit harder to find. There's not necessarily these huge ones that I absolutely love this week, but there's definitely enough that I think I can get into. And we'll start with that Army game. I do think Army's going to be able to just roll Air Force in this game. They're minus 22 right now. I do think they cover that number. Now, Army does have a huge amount of hurdles going forward. They have to be able to at least compete with Notre Dame. I'm not really sure how that's going to play in the CFP. Does a loss to Notre Dame sort of at a neutral site trump a loss to Oregon for Boise State? I don't really know how that's going to go down, but at the end of the day, you have quite a few hurdles going on. I do think there's a world where maybe they look forward just a little bit to Notre Dame. I think the rivalry aspect takes that out of it just a little bit. I do think they're going to want to be able to kind of lay their wood on Army the same way they've been able to do with really every team around the country. Air Force gave up over 300 yards rushing to Navy, and Army probably has a more potent attack than Navy. So I think Bryson Daly has a huge day. I do think this is one of those games where they probably win by like 4 touchdowns. They're probably up by like 3 touchdowns at halftime, frankly. Then you got Vanderbilt Auburn over 48.5 is my next one. I do think this is a very interesting game down there in Auburn this upcoming weekend. There are a number of really talented players on both offenses, no doubt about that. There's a couple of injuries on both offenses as well, but I do think the under is just going to make too much sense here. Vanderbilt has struggled this year with teams that have very athletic defensive lines that can stop kind of that north-south run. If they can't get Cedric Alexander, who is one of the guys that is questionable, if they can't get him running downhill, it's going to be really hard to get a lot of the stuff they do off of that, where you do the zone read, where you do a lot of the RPOs where they get out on the edge. A lot of those things can't really get going if you're able to stop that north-south run the way that Texas was a week ago, where that Vanderbilt offense looked a little bit more clunky than it has pretty much the entire year, and Auburn can absolutely do that. Maybe not to the same level Texas can, but absolutely it has a ton of athletic guys and can kind of slow down this rushing attack for Vanderbilt. I think for Auburn, they have that big playability, no doubt about that. But this Vanderbilt back end is plenty capable of taking the ball away, and they have an ability to make the most of it. I do think it's one of those games where Auburn hits a couple of big-time shots over the middle of the field. I also think it's one of those games where Vanderbilt's able to find just enough openings. Although, if you don't get that north-south run game going, it could get a little bit itchy. I think Vanderbilt's able to make enough plays. I think Auburn especially is able to make enough plays over the middle of the field and things get, at the very least, over that 48.5 number. It's one of those that I was a little bit on the fence about, but I do think these offenses are just looking for that big-time game. I think they'll be able to get at least enough in this one. And then I like Georgia, minus 16.5 at Florida. This is a very interesting game, one where you do have the rivalry aspect, and you do have Florida coming in with a ton of energy, playing really good football. So obviously, there's a little bit of juice around Florida. I think there's quite a few people probably picking Florida right about now. But I just think this is a really bad matchup against a team that seems to be kind of finding their stride. The Georgia offense has been able to not really find the run game this year, and it's one of those things that they're going to have to down the stretch. Thing is, Tate Ratledge comes back this week. If he comes back, I think this jump starts this offense. I think you see Trevor Etienne really start to get going against this former team, and I think they get incredible push on the offensive line. For Florida, I think this UGA pass rush is going to be too much. I think DJ Lagway is a really talented player. I don't think he's dealt with something like this, and I think it's going to get to him just a little bit. He'll turn over the ball a couple of times, and I think UGA wins by 21, 24 points. I really do think they go to work in this game, and I think that Carson Beck has a little bit of a coming out party in Jacksonville. Then you got Navy minus 11 at Rice. This is one of those games that's very, very interesting. You have a Navy team coming off a really tough loss to Notre Dame where they gave the ball away quite a few times, and then you have a Rice team that just got rid of Mike Bloomgren as their head coach. It could be really interesting because it's one of those things where sometimes you get a little bit of a bump from those teams right after they lose a coach. Sometimes you get a little bit of a dip. So we'll see what happens in this one. Navy is still a team that's in the CFP, but they also know they have to run the table the rest of the way. I do think if they are able to win the American, they're very much in the conversation, and things get really interesting in a hurry. That being said, they would have the tiebreaker over Memphis. They would have to win over Tulane the rest of the way. So definitely a lot of tough things coming. But at the end of the day, they are definitely a team that can make their way to the American Championship and possibly make some noise in that. And then for that Rice team, they're not necessarily great at stopping the run. And I think Navy is one of those teams that just made a ton of mistakes last week. There's no way they get the amount of luck or bad luck they did a week ago. So I think this one could get ugly. I think Navy wins this one comfortably, at least by 14, but maybe by even a little bit more than that. I like the A&M-South Carolina under 44.5, and this one makes me a little bit nervous because that number is so low. But at the end of the day, this is a huge game for Texas A&M, one of the bigger ones in their SEC history, because you win this one, you put yourself in a very, very good position to possibly run the table, to meet Texas at the very end of the year, and almost definitely get into the playoff. Obviously, there's some hurdles there, some craziness that could be worked out, but at the end of the day, you're almost definitely going to the playoff if you're able to handle business here, and then obviously able to win at Auburn in a couple of weeks. But it's one of those things where it's going to stay on the ground in this game. South Carolina is a team that doesn't necessarily want to get into a shootout, doesn't necessarily want to get into a world where Lenore Sellers has to make a ton of plays with his arm down the field. Now, on the other side, I do think it's going to be Marcel Reed. I think Marcel Reed is going to be able to go in this game, and I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see how this approach is against a really athletic defensive line. Maybe it's one of those things where this run game doesn't quite get going the way that they want, and they have to make a quarterback change or something crazy happens. But I really do think this could become something of a field goal off. I don't think there's going to be a ton of running room in this game, although Le'Veon Moss has every ability to get going in this game. I don't necessarily think it's going to be all that pretty. I think it's going to be a really tough rock fight, and whoever comes out on top. I picked South Carolina, but it's going to be a battle one way or the other. I think whoever wins this one probably wins the line of scrimmage battle, and that's going to be one that's going to be a fight pretty much from start to finish. So a huge one over there, and I think it's going to be a little bit of a rock fight in Columbia. Then you got USC Washington. I have the under 55.5. I think this is going to be a really interesting game because both these offenses have really struggled over the past couple of weeks. I think they're both kind of trying to make that big time statement. Thing is, they're going up against really, really bad matchups for their team. Now, Washington, I do think, could get something going in this game. For USC, you're throwing into one of the best maybe the best pass defense in the entire country in Washington. You have to be able to really thread a needle on some of these throws, and as good as Miller Moss has been, and as good as I think he is, it could be one of those games where it just kind of the wheels fall off a little bit, and Washington decides let's just run the ball. Let's just keep everything on the ground, not give them any big explosive plays on the defensive side, not give them that big jolt that they need, and just kind of handle business here. I wouldn't necessarily think that's crazy at all, and I think it's just one of those games where it starts really, really slow. I don't necessarily think either of these teams really get on the board, at least aggressively, until the second half, so I could see something like 14-7 at halftime or 10-3 or something crazy, and then things open up just a little bit, but not to that 55.5 number. I do like Clemson, minus 10.5 at Louisville. This is a bad spot for Louisville. They're going on the road. I believe they're playing their 7th straight game, which is absolutely insane on their 7th straight week. So they got a lot of things to figure out in this game, and they're going up against a team that hasn't necessarily had a true test since Georgia. So I fully understand being a little bit nervous about Clemson going into this game. But the reality is, I do think they've looked like a well-oiled machine. I think that offense is going to be just a load for Louisville to deal with. They're not necessarily a great defense on either aspect in pass defense or run defense, but they're absolutely a team that maybe if you commit to one part, you can absolutely stop this offense, but I'd be a little bit surprised. I think they have too many weapons. I think Cade Klubnik's running this offense too well, and I think this O-line is going to be able to hold up against this Louisville D-line. For Louisville, it's been a lot of feast or famine offensively. They've been able to make that big-time play, or they've been able to turn the ball over quite a bit and make a couple of mistakes and possibly give a team too many chances to win a game. You do that with Clemson, you're going to be in a really tough spot. And I think that Clemson D-line is going to not give you any room to run the ball. So I think Clemson wins this one. I think they win it pretty comfortably. I think they somewhat, at the very least, put everyone else in the country on notice. They make sure that everyone understands that this is a very real team, a team that could be dangerous down the stretch, and definitely one that is worth your time to watch because they're really, really fun, and I think it starts this weekend with a huge win. And then I do think that Indiana-Michigan State game gets over that 51.5. This is another one where you have Curtis Rourke coming back from injury, a little bit nervous about what's going to happen there. But at the end of the day, I think this Indiana offense is just ridiculous. I think they have every ability to score on pretty much anyone in the country. I don't think it's going to be much of an issue here. Now, obviously, you got to make sure you're ready to go, and you have to make sure that these Michigan State players can't necessarily key in on one thing. But at the end of the day, I do think it's going to be a load for Michigan State to handle. On the Michigan State side, I think Aiden Childs is just waiting for that big time performance. He played really well in the second half of that Iowa game, but I think there's a big one in him. I think he has one in this back end of the season that is going to shock some people, is going to put some people on notice for this kid, and it could very well be this game. Maybe he puts on a show in this one, maybe ends Indiana's undefeated season. It makes things really interesting around that Michigan State team going into 2025, but I think it's one of those games where it probably stays on the ground a little bit. Indiana's run defense is absolutely elite. I think this one is a little bit of it's one that I think you're going to have a couple of big plays in. I don't necessarily think it's going to be consistent scoring top to bottom. I think it's going to be a little bit of a fluctuating ebb and flow type of thing. But at the end of the day, I do think you're going to get enough points to get over that 51.5. I think Curtis Rourke makes enough plays in coming back as the quarterback for Indiana and Michigan State. I think Aiden Childs just has one on Saturday. I really do. I think he has every ability to explode in one of these games, and it might just be his time to do that on Saturday. But a ton of big-time games, and when you look at these best bets for this upcoming weekend, I think there's quite a few on the board right now that are just a little bit sketchy. You know, you worry that maybe Vegas has it right. Like the Nebraska game we just talked about a little bit ago, it's -6. I probably would go a little bit in Nebraska's direction. That being said, I don't want to go against Vegas and then look like an idiot. So I'm going to roll with the ones that I got. I do feel relatively good about those, and I think it could be one of those weekends where you have a lot of craziness happen, and definitely something to watch as we go into it because it's going to be really fun, and I think those bets, at the very least, hopefully, will get over 500. We'll have a very good week, and we'll be able to move forward feeling very good about where we are with these best bets. But let's take our final break here, and when we come back, we got quite a few things to update you on from this past weekend. We got a Georgia-Florida mix-up. They're going to be moving around a little bit over the next couple of years. We have the Big Ten not punishing anyone for that Michigan State-Michigan scuffle. You got the Big 12 dealing with some helmet comms issues, and then we'll give you some head coach updates, some injury updates, and everything else right after this, so stick with us.